She was alone in her backyard, sunglasses off, a glass of lemonade sweating in the sun. The water in the pool caught the afternoon light like a sheet of glass. It was a private moment in a private yard. Nothing more complicated than a breath of quiet on a busy street. Then a neighbor decided to make it a problem. Vernon Greaves stood on the sidewalk with his phone in his hand and a tight look in his eyes. From his vantage point, the woman by the pool was an anomaly. A black woman in $1 million house on a block he considered his to watch. He dialed 911 and, in a voice thin with suspicion, told the dispatcher someone was trespassing. He described her as if a presence alone could prove guilt. He did not know she had keys to that house. He did not know she was Chief Jalisa Rener, the newly appointed head of the county police department. By the time the first cruiser turned down the street, the afternoon had already shifted. 10 minutes later, 2 uniformed officers pulled into the driveway. Cole Durham and Reed Madsen were young, trained to respond quickly, and primed by the call they'd heard. They crossed the lawn without knocking, authority on their tongues, assumption in their posture. From the poolside, Jalisa watched them approach and, still calm, rose with her towel around her shoulders. "Miss, put your hands where we can see them," one officer ordered. She glanced at the men, and then, with a measured tone that carried both fatigue and authority, said, "I'm in my backyard, what's the problem?" The response was a rehearsal of commands. "Where are your identification cards? Who are you?" A hand reached out. The officers moved forward as if proximity could produce compliance. Vernon watched from the curb, vindication spreading across his face. When one officer stepped closer and reached for her arm, Jalisa did what she had trained officers to do in classrooms and in debrief rooms across the county. She evaded escalation, not with sarcasm or anger, but with composed refusal. She stepped back, palm open. "I'm not a threat," she said. "If you're going to detain me, do it with respect." An officer moved to physically control her. Instinct and habit pushed her to act, but not with the quick, panicked defiance of someone who needed to prove herself. With a small, deliberate motion, she reached into her wallet. The sun caught metal as she drew it out. A badge glinted. Gold, worn at the edges, stamped with a number and the title. "Chief Jalisa Rener," she said simply. "Badge 0417. Silence landed like a shock. The 2 officers froze, hands lowering as if gravity had changed. Vernon's expression shifted from triumph to something unreadable. The dynamic in the yard inverted in a single, undeniable instant. The neighbor who had called the police was now the subject of scrutiny. The officers who had entered as authority were suddenly the ones under command. Chief Rener did not gloat. She did not storm them with accusations. She asked for what the situation required, that they identify themselves properly, that they notify their supervisor, and that they document the encounter. She pointed to the corner of her house where a small security camera blinked red, recording every minute. "That camera has a clear view of the yard," she said. "Call your lieutenant and log this contact." Faced with the emblem of greater authority and the hard evidence the camera promised, the officers called in. Whatever confidence they had been carrying was replaced by the cautious formality of procedure. They radioed their supervisor, their words careful, the casual assumption replaced by compliance. Word of the encounter moved fast. Someone in the neighborhood, alerted by the flashing squad lights and the unusual pace of the scene, pulled a phone and captured a clip. The approach, the commands, the badge reveal. It made its way onto social platforms that evening, shared with astonishment and outrage. The short video, a private yard, a chief's badge glinting in sunlight, landed on feeds across Fairhope and soon beyond. Within hours, the county administration was in motion. Mayor Gloria Harston called a press conference the next morning. She stood at a podium flanked by city staff and a ceremonial flag, and she spoke plainly. The footage raised troubling questions about bias and protocol. She announced that the department had placed officers Cole Durham and Reed Madsen on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. She promised, carefully and without theatricality, that the department would review its policies on body-worn cameras, ensure supervisors reinforce de-escalation training, and expand anti-bias workshops. Those were not promises of instant transformation. They were administrative steps, suspension pending review, a commitment to training, a directive to require cameras to be activated during community calls. Still, to people in Fairhope who had watched the clip and felt the uneasy recognition of long-standing patterns, it was a tangible move toward accountability. Against that backdrop, officials from the Housing Authority and Code Enforcement arrived at Vernon Grev's door. Their visit was not theatrical revenge. It was the accumulation of civic complaints. Neighbors had filed earlier reports about harassment, excessive calling to authorities, and disruptive conduct. When officers left, they carried with them a packet of administrative notices, documentation of prior complaints, and a new eviction notice initiated under local nuisance ordinances. The eviction was presented as an administrative measure. It followed inspection, due process, and paperwork. It was one of several consequences that grew from what neighbors described as a pattern, not a single isolated action. Back at her home, Chief Rener convened an internal meeting at the police department. She addressed rank-and-file officers with the same steadiness she had shown in her backyard. "We will hold ourselves accountable," she said. "This department serves everyone in Fairhope. If people feel threatened by our actions or our assumptions, that is on us to correct." She ordered a review of incident reporting, made clear that supervisors must verify body cam activation after each call, and instructed the training division to accelerate anti-bias modules. Investigators were assigned to look into the conduct of the responding officers. The Sheriff's Internal Affairs Bureau coordinated with an independent oversight panel to ensure transparency. The town watched as one private moment, a woman sunbathing in her own yard, rippled outward into public consequences. For some residents, the video was affirmation. For others, it was a wake-up call. Conversations spread from kitchen tables to church halls to local radio shows. People spoke about the assumptions that quietly organize neighborhood life. Who belongs on a porch? Who is suspicious? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? The debate was imperfect and sometimes clumsy. It did not erase decades of lived experience in a single week. But the incident forced institutions to reckon with their routines. Amid the municipal machinery, the human heart of the story persisted. Over the fence that bordered her yard, a young girl named Zari watched with wide eyes. She came from 2 houses down and had seen Jalisa from time to time, a figure who walked the neighborhood in uniform, who talked to kids about safety at the summer block parties. Zari had questions. After the pressers and the internal memos and the briefings, she approached the fence with a paper cup of lemon water and the earnest confidence children have when they mean to bridge distance. Chief Rener knelt by the chain link so their faces were closer. No badge was needed for this moment. She smiled without artifice and said, "You belong here." She spoke not as a commander, but as a neighbor, and as someone who understood the small, daily tests of belonging. Zari pressed the cup into Jalisa's hand and told her she wanted to be a police officer when she grew up. Jalisa listened, asked her about school, and left a pin, a small token from the department, on the fence for Zari to keep. That private gesture became another image that people shared. It was not designed to erase the scald of suspicion the neighborhood had felt, but to suggest a different possibility: leadership that listens, and power that tends to tender things. In the days that followed, more formal recognition came in modest forms. A letter arrived from the governor's office thanking Chief Rener for her leadership during a difficult week and acknowledging the importance of the reforms being initiated. Along with the letter, a ceremonial pin was sent, small, symbolic, but meaningful to many who had watched the events unfold. The officers under investigation were treated in accordance with departmental rules. Administrative leave is not a verdict. It is a pause for inquiry. Investigators reviewed body cam footage, dispatch logs, and eyewitness statements. They interviewed Vernon, neighbors, and both responding officers. The Housing Authority's eviction process proceeded through its administrative channels, allowing Vernon to respond and appeal as local rules permit. None of these actions guaranteed a particular legal outcome. They set in motion official processes that would determine final dispositions. Public reaction did not settle into a single tone. Some called for harsher penalties, seeing the incident as symptomatic of broader problems. Others urged patience and emphasized due process for every individual involved. What the town did, however, was insist that systems answer for their actions. Mayor Harston's office began work with community groups to craft a more robust civilian oversight mechanism. The department rolled out mandatory sessions that mixed scenario-based training with community testimony. Body-worn camera policies were tightened, with supervisors tasked to verify recordings after critical incidents. These were small, bureaucratic steps, but their presence mattered to those who had felt invisible. For Chief Jalisa Rener, the episode was not a triumph in the traditional sense. It was an occasion for reflection and for leading with the routine she had advocated as a career law enforcement professional: transparency, accountability, and training paired with humility. She continued her work not as someone who had been vindicated, but as someone called to make the system she led better. She spoke at community forums without fanfare, listened to voices she did not always agree with, and pushed for measurable changes that could be tracked over months and years. And in a quieter register, the image of her that most people remembered was simple and stubborn: a woman in a swimsuit, sunglasses in hand, standing unfazed as officers readied themselves to control a scene that did not need controlling. The badge reveal was the pivot, but it was her restraint before and after that moment that lodged in people's minds. It was a demonstration that dignity can be a form of authority as powerful as a uniform. The story of Fair Hope spread because it contained a compact truth. Ordinary assumptions can have extraordinary consequences, and accountability starts when institutions notice and act on what their own procedures reveal. The viral clip did not erase the deeper work required: training, policy changes, community trust built over years. But it did accelerate questions that had long been idle on the margins. In the months that followed, the department published the findings of its internal review, redoubled its training commitments, and published a protocol for bystander interactions and camera activation. Some neighbors reported feeling a shift, subtle and human. More care in how calls were described, more oversight from supervisors, and a greater willingness among residents to speak up when they saw something wrong. There was no single moment of resolution, no tidy ending, because real change rarely arrives as a headline. It arrives as follow-through, as people returning to the ordinary work of community. On one late afternoon, after the mayor's announcements had cycled through local news and the governor's letter had been filed away, Chief Rener stood at the edge of her pool, with Zari playing at her feet. The sun slanted toward evening, and the water reflected a quieter light. She thought of the way the day had started, a small private pleasure interrupted by suspicion, a single call that spiraled beyond itself. She allowed herself a modest satisfaction, not in punishment meted out, but in the system doing what it was supposed to do when scrutiny was applied: investigate, correct, and try again. This was not a story of instant redemption for a town or an agency. It was a story of a moment that peeled back a thin layer, exposing assumptions and forcing institutions to respond. It was a story that reminded people, neighbors, officers, elected officials, that belonging is defended not only by policy, but by the habits of daily life. One woman's quiet afternoon had become a catalyst, prompting procedures to be revisited and young eyes like Zari's to imagine different futures. If this resonates with you, subscribe for more stories that examine how small moments become public reckoning. Have you ever witnessed something similar in your own neighborhood? Share it below. The conversation matters.